So Ben Franklin, when he wanted to make a friend out of a foe, would ask to borrow a book. And then a week later, would send the book back with a note of gratitude. And he said that he found that when he did that, that the person became a friend and would be very willing to do him another favor in the future. Why? Well, back then, remember, libraries were rare. And so when you're borrowing somebody's book, you're kind of appealing to their pride, that Ben Franklin is asking to borrow a book from my library. Must have a good library. And then the note of gratitude afterwards. We're sending the book back and a thank you for allowing this. That kind of combination allowed people they became friends, and they're much more willing to do him another favor in the future. The reason we bring that up is that in a parable that we're going to read this morning, Jesus talks about the shrewdness that wise people in this world have. And Ben Franklin was pretty shrewd in making a friend out of a foe, and at the same time setting that person up to be much more willing to do him a favor because of appealing to their pride and to their charity, if you will. And so we're going to jump into this passage in Luke and look at this parable together. It's, on the surface, a rather confusing parable. It's one of the few that when you read, I'm guessing that most of us went, I'm not sure what he means. Maybe it's just me. But look at Luke chapter 16 with me. And if you all understand perfectly what he means, then forgive me for taking the time to explain it and to talk about it. But Luke chapter 16. So, and we'll take this verse by verse for a little bit. And we read, and he said also unto his disciples, so note who he's teaching. He's sharing this parable to his disciples, not to the community at large. And he says this, there was a certain rich man which had a steward, and the same was accused unto him that he had wasted his goods. And so let's talk for a second. What is a steward? So just so that we're all on the same page, a steward, oikonomos in the Greek, is a house distributor or a manager, an overseer, an employee in that capacity. So it's somebody whose job it is to manage another person's house and all the money and the everything that happens with it, right? So you would be a manager on somebody else's behalf, managing their goods. So that's the definition. So Jesus starts with this parable by saying there was a rich man, a lord, right, wealthy, and he was so wealthy that he had at least one steward. You could almost read into this to say that there was more than one steward, but let's just call it a steward that was managing his goods. So he was responsible for some of his lord's property, or the buying and the selling that was going to occur. And he says, and the same was accused. So somebody else, maybe another steward, we don't know, somebody else approaches the Lord, the rich man, and says, sir, that man that's in your employ, that man that's working for you is cheating you. He's cheating you. Just thought you'd want to know that he is not being diligent in the way he's running your property, right? And that he had wasted his goods. And so the idea of wasting goods isn't even cheating in the way like I'm skimming off the top and I'm taking money for myself and I'm pocketing it, right? That would be one form of cheating where, you're going to buy some stuff for me, but I'm going to raise the price of the corn that you're buying, and I'll take that 5% that I just raised the price, and that 5% goes in my pocket, and you get the rest, and you don't know because I just kind of jacked up the price a little bit. So that's one form of cheating. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about somebody who was wasting his goods. And so the idea of wasting somebody else's goods, if you wanted to put yourself in his shoes, would be that this rich man has so much that I really don't have to be super careful. in the way I manage his estate. Right? I mean, he's not going to notice if I don't get the best price, or if I don't sell it at the highest dollar, or if I'm not buying at the lowest price. Right? It doesn't matter. He's got so much, it doesn't matter. We had somebody over yesterday, and they were talking, and they were saying, why do billionaires care so much about their money? I don't know, a young guy brought it up. Why do billionaires care so much about their money? Well, and somebody else was saying, well, if they didn't, they wouldn't be billionaires. So rich man, to be rich, you kind of got to care. You got to pay attention. It doesn't normally just happen. And so this man did not take his position seriously. He didn't care to do the best that he could for his Lord, for the person that was employing him. So that's what we read in the first verse, that he had been accused and that he had wasted his goods. And he called him, we read in verse 2, and said unto him, how is it that I hear this of thee? He pulls him aside and he says, this is what I've heard of you. This is what I've heard. Why is it that I'm hearing this? And so now he goes on and he says, give an account of thy stewardship. You need to give me an account of your management. For thou mayest be no longer steward. So you can almost imagine you get called into the boss's office, and the boss isn't going to just fire you because it might be another steward, another manager who doesn't like how good you're doing, that is kind of bad-mouthing you. And so the boss, the Lord in this case, says, how is it? Why is it that I hear this about you? Show me a record of your transactions. We are going to sit and we are going to review your management. And depending on what comes out of this review, you're going to get fired. Right? That's the essence of verse 2. And in verse 2, it's also clear that the review isn't happening live because the steward has some time. And what we find out about this steward is that he's shrewd. And he probably was wasting his Lord's goods. And we read in verse 3, then the steward said within himself, what shall I do? For my Lord taketh away from me the stewardship. I cannot dig. To beg, I'm ashamed. So Jesus, as he's sharing the story, gives us insight into the steward's mind, right? Into what the steward is thinking, this manager. And so you imagine the steward leaves the boss's office. He's now been tasked with collecting all the records, and he's going to get audited by his Lord and maybe somebody else that the Lord calls in, and they're going to review everything, right? And depending on what comes out of this, he's going to get fired. Now, we can read from what he's thinking that he knows he's wasted his Lord's goods because he anticipates getting fired. He anticipates that the outcome of this audit is he's getting canned. And he's like, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? I can't dig. Now, I wonder why he said I can't dig. Like, is it beneath him? I was a manager. I was in charge of the Lord's house. I was in charge of making deals. I can't dig. That would be so beneath me. Maybe it's that's the case, right? Maybe the case is that he's gotten a little soft. It doesn't take too much muscle to point and tell people what they need to pay and how much you're going to sell for and where to move things and how to manage the house. Right? It doesn't take a lot of muscle. So he's like, I can't be a laborer. I'll die. I'm just guessing on that one. I can't dig. And in fact, to beg, well, I definitely can't be a beggar. I mean, he's not going to get a job as another steward, right? There's probably only so many rich men to go around, and word probably gets out very quickly amongst the lords and the rich men that somebody has been wasteful in the way they managed somebody else's affairs. And so he is stuck in a position, what am I going to do? I'm going to be without a job. I'm going to have a bad reputation. I likely won't be able to get another job at what I'm doing. So what do? I could be a laborer, but I can't really be a laborer for one reason or another. Maybe it seems like maybe it's physical, not sure, because he's ashamed to beg, but he's not ashamed to dig, but he just says, I can't dig. So you got this guy who's stuck in a rock and a hard place. And what's he going to do? And so we read in verse 4 what this man becomes resolved to do. I am resolved what to do, that when I am put out of the stewardship, they may receive me into their houses. So he called every one of his Lord's debtors unto him, and said unto the first, How much owest thou unto my Lord? So this man, he stops, he thinks, I need to set up some favors. I need to set up some IOUs. Have you ever had an IOU? You know, where somebody owes you something? So he's like, I need to set up some IOUs. I need people to owe me something. So he was a steward. He hasn't gone and laid out the audit, and he hasn't been audited yet. It's coming. He knows what they're going to find. So he goes on and says, all right, I'm going to set up, if they're going to find me stuff to fire me, might as well make it real. He calls in the person that owes him something, that owes his boss something, and he says, how much do you owe my Lord? How much owest thou my Lord? And he said, the man says, 100 measures of oil. I owe your Lord 600 gallons of oil. It's a lot of oil. I probably would have fetched, when you think about even today, right, those are 50-gallon barrels, and that's a lot of barrels that we're talking about. There's 600 gallons of oil. And he said unto him, and he said, in verse 6, and he said 100 measures of oil, or 600 gallons, and he said unto him, take thy bill, sit down quickly, and write 50. So he said, okay, let's take your bill, cross out the 100, and write in 50. So you're going to say that you only owe 300 gallons. And have a good day, by the way. Have a good day. So he just created an IOU for himself, right? This man just got his bill cut in half with no obligation, and he leaves. And so he called, and then he said, in verse 7, then said he to another, and how much owest thou? And he said, 100 measures of wheat. Or, this one doesn't make so much sense to us because we don't know really picture bushels these days, but 65 bushels. Okay, so whatever a bushel is, he owed 65 bushels. And he said, 100 measures of wheat. And the steward says unto him, take thy bill and write 80, or 80. So not quite half, but take a quarter off. Right? And he then proceeds to do this with everybody. We just get two examples, but the steward proceeds to do this with everybody. With all the debtors, he calls in the debtors, and for whichever ones maybe he kind of already had a relationship with, he makes a deal. He cuts their price, he cuts what they owe, and in a way, what's he doing? He's getting them to like him. He's getting them to owe him one and preparing them to do him a favor. And why do we know that? Verse 4 says, I am resolved what to do, that when I am put out of the stewardship, when I am fired, they may receive me into their houses. So when I'm fired, I can come knocking and say, hey, do you mind helping me out? Remember how I helped you? Do you mind helping me out? Right? You get it. It's wheeling and dealing. It's being wise in the ways of this world. And so the day comes when we have our audit and the Lord looks at the books. And it's really interesting what Jesus says in this parable. And the Lord commended the unjust steward. Right? And the Lord commended the unjust steward because he had done wisely. For the children of this world are in their generation wiser than the children of light. And so we start to get into the a little bit confusing part of this message, of this story that Jesus is sharing, because on the surface, it almost seems like this Lord is giving the servant, the steward, an attaboy for cheating. And Jesus then proceeds in this analogy, in this story, to say that the children of this world are wiser than the children of light. And I don't know, when I first read this, I remember years ago, you'd kind of scratch your head and go, I'm not sure I get it. Especially, you read some more and it gets even more confusing. So let's break this down a little bit and think about this. So when the Lord heard, he commended him isn't to like give him an attaboy, like you did a good job for me, as much as that he acknowledged that you were smart. I got to hand it to you. That was some quick thinking. And in a way, he almost says, I admired this man, right? I acknowledged that this man had acted wisely. But did he act wisely? As soon as I read this, I was thinking of Brother Doug and conversations that Doug and I would have had about the word wise and what the word wise means and who's wise and what is wisdom, right? And so did this man act wisely? And what does wise mean in this context? Let's just get it out there, first of all. So the word wise is phronimos in the Greek. It's an adverb. And it does mean prudently or wisely. But as we think about the context, to be prudent isn't necessarily wisdom in this context. It's actually, if you think of the word shrewd, right? Shrewdness or quick. It's prudent. It's not godly wisdom. It's not the wisdom from above. It's somebody who's shrewd. Think of a really good businessman, right? A really good businessman knows how to take advantage of a situation for his best interest. Is it wise? Is it right in all cases? No, but it is shrewd. And this man acted shrewdly, Jesus says in his examples, right? He acted prudently. In the moment, he took care of himself. So he created a safety net. This man had created a safety net. And so Jesus then finishes the story, and he says that the children, he kind of interjects. That's the end of the story, by the way, right? So the story ends right there. And he says, and the Lord commended the unjust steward because he had done wisely, period. And now he starts to interject some thoughts. And so he interjects a thought, and he says that the children of this world are wiser. How does he say it? Let's go back there again. Verse 8. For the children of this world are in their generation wiser than the children of light. So, children of the world, who are children of the world? Remember that as Jesus is speaking to his disciples, the context that they would have understood this in, right? They would have understood the children of this world to be Gentiles, to be heathen, the people that weren't God's children. So the children of this world are those that mind earthly, worldly things, Gentiles. He's speaking to his disciples who are Jewish. It would have been an us and them environment. He's talking about people who are Gentiles, who aren't believers. Who are the children of light? Those would be, the disciples would have understood the children of light to be themselves and would have understood it to be the Jewish people, the children of light. And he says that in their generation, in the moment, the children of the world are more shrewd, are quicker, are acting more appropriately than the children of light. Just stop in there, though. You got to scratch your head and go, okay, well, what does that mean? Right? What does that mean? How is this parable about cheating your boss mean that you're doing a better job, you're acting more prudently? So let's keep reading. I promise you it'll start to make more sense as we get a little bit further, even though it's pretty confusing right now. So Jesus is going to confuse us even more. He says in verse 9, "And I say unto you, make to yourselves friends of the mammon of unrighteousness, that when ye fail, they may receive you into everlasting habitation. And I say unto you, make to yourselves friends of the mammon of unrighteousness, that when you fail, they may receive you into everlasting habitation." So, use your money to make friends so that when you fail, they can send you to heaven. Right? I mean, if I take this verse literally and just break it down just like that, that's what it's saying. Use your money to make friends so that when you fail, they can send you to heaven. That doesn't make any sense. So obviously, my interpretation is not right. So let's break it down, and let's try to understand this verse, because it is really relevant to all of us. So the key, I would say, to understanding this verse, and then it starts to help us understand the entire parable, is the last phrase. So in the last phrase in verse 9, Jesus says that they may receive you into everlasting habitation, that they may receive you when you get to heaven. So the clue is that whoever I'm supposed to be making friends with is going to be in heaven. That when I get there, they're going to be in heaven. And so let's ask ourselves, who's going to be in heaven? So let's turn to Matthew chapter 5 together. Matthew chapter 5, Jesus is doing the Sermon on the Mount. And in verse 2, in chapter 5, we get the Beatitudes. Remember those? "And he opened his mouth and taught, saying, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so persecuted they the prophets which were before you." And so if we look at this, and you can think of other passages in the New Testament as well that I'm sure can come to mind, that as you think about what Jesus is saying and who he's saying is going to be in heaven, who are the people that are going to be in heaven? Well, those that are poor in spirit. Right? Verse 3 says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So first, the poor in spirit, those that recognize how poor they are, not physically necessarily, but how poor they are spiritually, that they need a Savior. Right? Those that are going to cling to God, not on their own abilities or not on their own kind of strength, but those that recognize that they can't do it, that they need a Savior. So blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So one group that's going to be in heaven are those that recognize their need for God. Another one that he throws out there, and this is the beginning of his ministry, is those that are persecuted. Persecuted for who? Well, he talks about it in verse 10, and he talks about it in verse 11 and 12, about those that are persecuted for his sake. Right? For those of you that have dedicated your lives to me, those of you that are willing to take it on the chin, and not just on the chin, but you're willing to do whatever it takes for me and are willing to suffer the loss for my kingdom, that you're willing to be reviled, that you're willing to be falsely accused, that you're willing to be lied about, that you're willing to be persecuted and beaten and whipped and killed, right? For my name, for righteousness' sake, in my name, right? You will also be in heaven. And this isn't the only place that it talks about it in Scripture. But there's this clear kind of notion as to who's going to be there. And so if we think about that, as the kind of the beginning, right? Who's going to be there? Let's go back to Luke now. And in chapter 16, he says, make friends. Well, maybe we got to back up. What's mammon? So mammon, I'm not going to bother reading the Greek word and all of that. It's very similar to mammon. Mammon is wealth, right? Wealth. So to have mammon is to have wealth, just in a simple way. So he says, use mammon of unrighteousness. Use worldly wealth. Use money to make friends. We're supposed to use our money so we're supposed to use money to make friends, right? I'm going to pay off people to be my friend. So he's talking to his disciples. Remember, we talked about at the beginning, he's talking to his disciples. So he's telling his disciples to use wealth for some sort of gain. And he's also, they know that he's not talking about the Pharisees, right? So it's not like make friends of those that are going to be in heaven, that are the righteous. So it wouldn't be the Pharisees, because they know how he feels about the Pharisees. So who is he talking about? And what would you use your money for? So to not stretch it out any longer, use the wealth that you've accumulated to help people. Specifically, if you think about Matthew 5, right? Make friends. Benefit other people with the money that you've gotten. Benefit people with the money that you've accumulated. And on the day you die, they're going to be in heaven waiting for you. They're not getting you to heaven. They're not getting you to heaven. Those people aren't getting you to heaven. But those people are going to be in heaven. And they'll be waiting for you. In a very general sense. Now, he says, and we could kind of continue here, he that is faithful in that which is least is faithful also in much. And he that is unjust in the least is unjust also in much. If therefore you have not been faithful in the unrighteous mammon, who will commit to your trust the true riches? And this kind of comes full circle. Like, step one is to understand whose money is it? So when I've accumulated money, and I'm a millionaire, or I'm even got $50 to my name, whose money is it? Is it not God's money? Am I not a steward of God's money? Are we not stewards of what we've been given by God? So step one is to recognize that I've been given stewardship. And I need to be faithful in that stewardship, and I need to use that money, whatever I've been given, the wealth that I've accumulated, to benefit God's kingdom. Right? One aspect of this story. For the believer, for those of us that are believers, do we recognize that the wealth that we have is not ours? And I think everybody here recognizes that the wealth that we have, regardless of how much wealth or how little wealth, is not ours. But what do we do with it? That's what Jesus is asking. And if you're faithful in little, you'll be given more to be faithful with. And if you're not faithful with little, you're not going to be given more to work with. But the comment for all of us is to recognize the people in need, specifically those that are living for the kingdom, those that are out on the front lines being persecuted, those that are on the front lines living for the kingdom, and help where we can. Use the money that we have been trusted with, the wealth that we've been entrusted with, whatever it is, whether it's 1 talent, 5, or 10, for God's glory. Right. So the shrewdness, and the reason Jesus says that the children of this world are shrewder, are wiser, or they're more shrewd than we are in their generation, is that sometimes we forget that what we have is not the end goal. The money that we've accumulated or the wealth that we have or whatever we have is not the end goal. It's been given to us to use, right? It's been given to us to use rather than to accumulate and to collect it and to hoard it like that rich man who built bigger barns. What we're supposed to do is, as we're given wealth by God, we're supposed to use it. And that the parable there is direct then, when you think about it in that context. The parable that Jesus uses about that unjust steward, the cheating manager, is a direct correlation. It's recognizing that man saw that he needed to make other plans, and he used the position to make other plans. For us, it's also to recognize that the money that we have and the wealth is not the end. Right? It's not the end. We've been given it by God, and we have to use it for his purpose, not for ourselves. And that's one aspect of this parable. So it's interesting that if we continue to read, we read, he says, "No servant can serve 2 masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will hold to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon." So be careful. Don't start to collect. Don't start to accumulate. You're going to start to serve the money rather than the money serving God. So be careful. But the Pharisees, and this is where it gets really interesting too, the Pharisees also, who were covetous, heard all these things, and they derided him. So the Pharisees heard this, and they scoffed, right? They scoffed. And he said unto them, "You are they which justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts." Right? And so they laughed, giving money to the poor, distributing what we've been given, that's foolishness, right? That's foolishness. And he says, you justify yourselves. You are they which justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts. For that which is highly esteemed among men is abomination in the sight of God. So the Pharisees heard, and they laughed, and they shook their heads, and they said, "Oh, what teaching? What teaching?" And Jesus says, you justify yourselves. You think that you're right and you're good, and that you shake your head at my teaching, and yet God knows your heart. Right? God knows it to them. So for the believer, this parable for me was really interesting, in that just reminding me as a believer, not that I'm supposed to cheat. That's not the point of this parable, that I'm supposed to cheat and I'm supposed to use money to buy friends. That's not what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to recognize that the money is not the end itself, that the wealth is not the end, but that wealth is given to me by God and it's his, and that I'm supposed to work with it. I'm supposed to work with it. I'm supposed to use it for his kingdom. I'm supposed to help the poor in spirit. I'm supposed to help those that are being persecuted for righteousness' sake. I'm supposed to help those that are on the front lines for the kingdom. And the result of that help, not by buying my way into heaven at all, but the result of that help, because my heart is right with God, because I care for his people, because I recognize that my wealth and what I've gained is not for my good, but it's for his good. Because of all of that, when I die and I'm in heaven, those people that I've helped, they're going to be there, and I'm going to be the blessed because I've used what I've been given by God to help his servants, his people, and they will be in heaven with me, right? It's a full circle story, and it's such a powerful message in that context. This story in this parable that he's giving is also for the unbeliever, for those of us that don't know Jesus Christ, that have not surrendered our lives to him, right? This message is for you too, because this message is about recognizing that I have a limited amount of time. That I have a limited amount of time, that the audit is coming. And for those of you that don't know what the audit is that the books are going to be open. Matthew 25, when the judgment day comes, right? The judgment day is going to come, and I'm going to be looked at. And you have a window now. Right? As an unbeliever, if I don't know Jesus Christ, we have a window now. And that window is to recognize that I need to prepare. I can't just dilly-dally, that I have a window. And in this window, I need to surrender to Jesus and make a friend of Jesus rather than a friend of my own. So just keep that in mind. Interesting parable, hard to look at. You know, it was interesting. I would say that maybe there's some disagreement on my interpretation. I'd say that the interpretation that I give you, that I shared with you today, that there's a lot of backing to it, scriptural, theological backing to it. I would just say that some people also, there's a lot of question about that verse 9, but it makes sense to me the way I shared it. It was clear of what the point of this message was. So I just pray that we'd all take it to heart, consider that everything we've been given with, no matter how much or how little, belongs to God, and that we need to use it for God's purpose, not for ourselves. Amen.